Keanu Reeves stood in the corridor outside the server bay and watched three men in pressed suits carry slim laptops through the glass doors of the main operations center at Apex Corridor Systems, the company headquartered on the 12th floor of the Harwell Tower in downtown Charlotte, North Carolina. He recognized all three of them, not because they were competitors, because he had spent 4 months sitting across from each of them in a small conference room on the 9th floor, walking them through distributed architecture principles he had spent years building from the ground up. He had trained them, and now they were being escorted in to replace him. The CEO had approved the move 3 days ago, $214,000 per year for each of them. She had no idea that the man she had terminated 11 days earlier at $73,000 a year was the reason those three men had anything to offer at all. But what happens when a system built by one man collapses in the hands of the people who were supposed to replace him? And what happens when the truth of who that man really was finally comes to light, in a way that no one in that building was prepared for? To understand how we got here, you have to go back to the beginning, not to the boardroom, not to the servers, not to the contracts. You have to go back to a Tuesday morning and a bowl of oatmeal with brown sugar on the left side, because that was the only side his daughter Sadie would eat it from. Keanu was 41 years old. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the south end of Providence Road in Charlotte, in a building where the elevator worked most of the time, and the super, a retired pipefitter named Harold, always had strong opinions about the weather. Keanu's commute was 22 minutes by bus. He took the same seat every morning, 3rd row from the front, right side, because the window there had a crack in the seal that let in just enough cool air to keep him thinking clearly on the way in. His daughter Sadie was 22 years old. She was finishing her last semester at UNC Charlotte, studying environmental engineering, and she had her mother's habit of making a sound between a sigh and a laugh whenever something struck her as both funny and frustrating at the same time. Keanu had not noticed she did that until after her mother was gone. Then he heard it every single day and could not stop hearing it, and was grateful every single time. There was a photograph on the kitchen windowsill. A woman in a yellow cardigan standing in front of a lake somewhere in Western Virginia, shielding her eyes from the sun, smiling at whoever was behind the camera. Keanu looked at it every morning and every evening. He had not moved it in 6 years. He made Sadie's oatmeal on weekday mornings when she was home, which was most weekday mornings, because UNC Charlotte was close enough for her to commute on the days she wanted to, and Keanu had never once suggested she do anything differently. He made the oatmeal the same way every time. He put the brown sugar on the left side. He had learned early on that it mattered which side, and so he had never stopped putting it on the left side, and Sadie had never had to ask. Apex Corridor Systems was an infrastructure technology firm. It occupied floors 9 through 12 of the Harwell Tower, and it employed just under 800 people. Its core product was a distributed data routing and synchronization platform called GridFlow, which served 61 enterprise clients across banking, logistics, and regional healthcare networks. Without GridFlow, 3 credit unions in the Carolinas could not reconcile their overnight ledgers. A freight management company based in Concord could not track its cross-state fleet in real time. A regional hospital group serving 11 counties in western North Carolina could not push updated patient records between facilities fast enough to matter during a crisis. GridFlow was not glamorous. It was not the kind of system that got featured at conferences or mentioned in press releases. It was essential in the way that foundations are essential, which is to say it was noticed only when something went wrong. Keanu's official title at Apex was Systems Maintenance Lead. He had chosen that title himself more than 4 years ago when he asked HR for a reduced-scope role for reasons he described as personal. The HR coordinator who processed the paperwork, a young woman named Kirsten, had looked at the form 3 times because she had never received a voluntary demotion request before. She had eventually stamped it, filed it, and moved on, because the request had been polite, and the paperwork was clean, and organizations rarely have a protocol for questioning why someone would want less. Before the voluntary demotion, before the title change, and the quieter role, and the Tuesday morning bus rides, Keanu had been the lead architect of GridFlow. He had designed the platform from the first specification document. He had written the core synchronization logic over the course of 16 months, testing edge case behaviors on a personal workstation in the second bedroom of his apartment during the years when Sadie was in high school and the house was quiet by 9 and he had no particular reason to stop working. He had built the thermal load management subsystem from scratch, a module he called SyncGuard, because nothing in the open-source ecosystem handled the specific combination of data throughput variance and ambient surheat that Apex's server environment produced during the high-demand months of July and August. He had written the documentation, filed the internal architecture reviews, trained 3 successive teams of junior engineers, and for 5 years had been the single person most responsible for the thing that made Apex worth what it was worth. Then his wife, Renata, died. He did not talk about that. There was a photograph on the kitchen windowsill to prove she had existed, and that was as much as he kept visible. He had told HR he needed a lower stress role for personal reasons, and HR had produced the paperwork, and Keanu had signed it without drama, and on the following Monday he was a maintenance lead, and the Monday after that, and eventually it became simply who he was in that building. He was good at it. He could tell from the sound of the rack assembly whether the system was running clean. He knew which fans ran slightly louder at high load. He knew the faint electronic tick that it produced whenever the ambient temperature in that quadrant climbed above 91 degrees Fahrenheit. Some of what he knew had never been written down anywhere. Some of what had been written down had been filed in places no one thought to look, and some of it lived only in the memory of the man. Everyone agreed was the maintenance lead. He also knew about Garrett. Garrett Hollis was Apex's vice president of operations. He was 49 years old, and he wore his authority the way certain men wear expensive watches, with constant peripheral awareness of whether anyone else was noticing it. He had been at Apex for 10 years, and, in that time had developed what could charitably be called a talent for situational management, which is to say he was very good at identifying which people in the organization carried the kind of knowledge that could become a problem. Keanu had that kind of knowledge. Not because he had gone looking for anything, but because in the course of running routine infrastructure audits 18 earlier, he had opened a subdirectory he had not expected to find populated, and found within it a series of encrypted file exchanges between Garrett and an external consulting group that had no documented relationship with Apex. He had not opened the files. He had noted the directory path the same way he noted every anomaly, accurately, quietly, without forgetting, and had moved on. Garrett did not know exactly what Keanu had seen, but Garrett was the kind of man who stayed attuned to his exposure, and Keanu represented a category of exposure that Garrett found intolerable. Deep system access, an excellent memory, no particular incentive to protect anyone's secrets. When the board brought in Victoria Sloan as the new CEO 8 weeks ago, Garrett had understood immediately that this was an opening. A new CEO arrives without an existing map of the human landscape underneath the org chart. She would need reliable guidance about what mattered and who could be trusted. Garrett was very good at being that guide. Victoria had come to Apex from a financial strategy firm in Washington, D.C., where she had spent 11 years advising companies on operational efficiency. She was 38, precise, and genuinely intelligent. She could read a financial model the way most people read a newspaper, quickly, looking for the story underneath the numbers. What she did not yet have, because she had been in the building only 8 weeks, was a reliable map of who actually kept the lights on. The proposal Garrett placed in front of her was clean and well documented. It was 47 slides. It contained a cost-per-output analysis of the technical operations team, a benchmarking comparison against industry compensation standards, and a section titled Capability Modernization that made a careful, data-supported argument for replacing the current maintenance and monitoring function with a specialized external team whose credentials represented what Garrett called best-in-class institutional training. He mentioned that one of the incoming specialists, Nathan Bird, had held a senior role at Salesforce. He mentioned that Clara Ashford had studied at Carnegie Mellon. He mentioned that Todd Whitman had spent 4 years at Oracle's infrastructure division. He presented their combined annual cost as an investment in future scalability, rather than a replacement expense. He did not mention that all 3 of them had learned the foundational principles of distributed synchronization architecture inside an Apex training program 4 years earlier. He did not mention who had designed and taught that program. Victoria approved the proposal in the time it took to ask 4 questions, all of them financial. All of them answered cleanly. She signed the authorization and moved to the next item. No one in that room thought to ask who was actually running the system every day. It simply did not occur to anyone to ask. This is the part of the story worth pausing on, because it happens in organizations more often than anyone in leadership tends to admit. There is the org chart, and there is the real map of who keeps things running. The first is built from titles and salary grades and reporting lines. The second is built from years of specific accumulated knowledge, the kind that lives in the mind of the person who pauses beside the server rack each morning and listens before walking to his desk. When those two maps are confused for each other, the cost is almost never visible immediately. But it always arrives eventually. Keanu was eating a sandwich in the maintenance bay when Kirsten from HR found him. It was a Thursday, just past noon. She handed him an envelope. She delivered the language carefully, the way people deliver language they have been coached to deliver. Position restructured. Effective end of week. 90 days severance. Return of access credentials and equipment. Keanu put the sandwich down. He turned the envelope over once in his hands. "Who's going to monitor the sync guard thresholds on Node 8? He asked. Kirsten looked at him the way people look at someone who has said something in a language they recognize but cannot follow. "I'm sorry? Node 8. He kept his voice even. "There's a thermal behavior that develops when ambient temperature crosses 91 degrees and simultaneous data load exceeds a specific threshold. It needs a particular intervention sequence, or it cascades into a full synchronization failure. Has anyone briefed the incoming team on that?" Kirsten's expression did not change, but the slight stillness in it told him everything. The incoming team had been given access to all documented system materials, she said. Keanu nodded once. He put the envelope in his jacket pocket. He turned back to the terminal and completed the task he had been running, a minor routing inconsistency he had flagged that morning. The kind of thing that was harmless today and would become a real problem in 6 weeks if left unaddressed. He corrected it. He verified the result. He saved the log with a timestamp. Then he stood up. "Thank you, Kirsten," he said. He folded his jacket over his arm, collected his personal items from the drawer of his workstation, and walked out through the main operations floor toward the elevator. As he crossed the floor, he passed the glass-walled conference room where Nathan, Clara, and Todd were being walked through the space by Garrett. There was a small group of employees watching the introduction from outside the glass. Someone was clapping. Todd had a badge lanyard already around his neck. It had been a fast transition. Nathan was mid-sentence when he saw Keanu. His eyes moved to the man with the box, then to the exit, and something crossed his face that was more complicated than recognition. It was the expression of someone who understands exactly what they are witnessing and does not know what to do with that understanding. He half raised one hand. Garrett stepped sideways, steering Nathan's attention back to the room and the introduction and the slide deck on the screen. The moment closed. Victoria was at the top of the open staircase that overlooked the floor. She had been watching the conference room introduction when she noticed the man with the box moving toward the lobby. He was walking at no particular speed. His jacket was folded over his arm. He turned once to hold the elevator door for a woman who was hurrying from the opposite direction, and then he was inside the elevator, and the doors closed. Victoria watched the elevator indicator lights for a moment. Then she turned back to the conversation she had been having. In the lobby, the security desk was staffed by a man named Earl, who had worked the morning shift at Harwell Tower for 7 years, and who knew every regular visitor by name, most of them by which elevator they preferred, and a few of them by what they ordered from the coffee cart near the east entrance. Earl came around the desk when he saw Keanu. There was a brief exchange between the two men, the quiet acknowledgement that passes between people who have shared a daily routine for years. Earl held the main door. Outside, the afternoon was already warm, July in Charlotte. The heat came up off the sidewalk in waves that were not yet uncomfortable, but announced what was coming. That evening, after Sadie had gone back to campus for a late study session, Keanu sat at the kitchen table with his personal laptop open. He was not looking at job listings. He had received 3 messages from former colleagues at other firms before he even reached home, which told him something about the speed at which professional networks move when they sense real expertise becoming available. He would read those messages tomorrow. Tonight he was finishing something he had been building for the better part of a year. A comprehensive operational guide for grid flow, written the way he would write a guide for someone who had to keep the system running alone at 2 in the morning. With no support and no one to call. Not an architecture document. Not an internal wiki entry. A real document. Step-by-step failure responses. Edge case behaviors cataloged by the specific conditions that triggered them. Manual override sequences for every documented anomaly and several that had never made it into official documentation. At the center of it was a detailed section on sink guard. He wrote carefully. At a certain point, he added a note in the thermal management section. He described the Node 8 condition specifically. Ambient temperature above 91 degrees combined with simultaneous data load exceeding 93% of peak capacity. He noted the exact activation conditions. He noted what happened to sink guard's state memory if the synchronization buffer was cleared during a thermal event, which was a catastrophic reset rather than a clean recovery, and which would cascade across adjacent nodes if not caught within a specific window. He wrote out the recovery sequence in full. Every step, the intervals between stages, the temperature readings that determined whether the sequence needed to be slowed down or could proceed at standard pace. He saved the document to his personal drive. He did not send it to anyone at Apex. He sat for a moment looking at the screen. Then he closed the laptop, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. The 3 new specialists had their kickoff meeting with Victoria and Garrett Bratt the following Monday. They presented a modernization roadmap that was objectively impressive. 18 months. A projected 12% reduction in infrastructure operating costs. An expanded architecture capable of onboarding 15 additional enterprise clients. The slides were polished and the Q&A was fluent, and Victoria sat through it with the focused attention she brought to every presentation, asking pointed questions that Nathan, Clara, and Todd handled well. After the meeting, Nathan pulled up the original GridFlow architecture files in the shared repository. He was thorough enough to want to understand the foundation before modifying it. He opened the primary design folder, skimmed the top-level file, noted that the organization was unusual, not built around standard industry conventions, but around a set of design principles he did not immediately recognize, with hand-annotated decision trees that did not follow any format he had been trained on, and closed it. Older documentation style, he said to Clara. We'll want to rebuild the documentation layer before we make any structural changes. Clara agreed. They moved on to the monitoring layer, which they could begin improving immediately. There is something worth noticing in that moment, not as a judgment of Nathan, who was capable and thorough, but as a pattern that plays out in organizations so frequently it has almost become invisible. The things we do not recognize, we tend to assume are obsolete. The things we were not trained on, we tend to believe are inferior to the things we were. It is a quiet form of arrogance that lives inside competence, which is precisely why it is so hard to see. The first 3 weeks went smoothly. Clara found a redundant process in the synchronization monitoring layer and eliminated it. The process had looked like a duplicate logging function from every angle she examined it. Removing it produced cleaner system logs and reduced background resource consumption. It was a reasonable call. Todd streamlined traffic routing on 5 secondary nodes. Nathan tightened up the alert threshold parameters across the board. Victoria received weekly summaries that reflected genuine measurable improvement. Garrett reviewed each summary with visible satisfaction. What none of them knew, what no one currently working in that building understood, was that the process Clara had removed was the secondary validation check SyncGuard used to confirm its thermal state memory before engaging the Node 8 compensation protocol. It had not looked like part of SyncGuard from the outside. It had not been labeled as part of SyncGuard in any of the documentation they had access to, because SyncGuard's internal architecture had never been fully mapped in the official documentation. That mapping existed only in the document on Keanu's personal drive, and in the memory of the man who had built it. It was the first week of August when it happened. The night was a Wednesday, which was the same night of the week Keanu had been handed his termination envelope, though no one who might have noticed that coincidence was in a position to find it relevant. The temperature outside had reached 94 degrees by 4 in the afternoon and had not fallen below 87 by midnight. It was the third consecutive day of a heat event that the National Weather Service had classified as significant. Inside the Apex server facility, the climate control systems were working at full capacity, and the ambient temperature in the Node 8 quadrant had been reading at 90.7 degrees since 10 that evening. Below the threshold, but close. The first signs of irregular behavior appeared at 11:41 that night. Small latency spikes on the Node 8 routing table. The automated monitoring system flagged them as moderate priority, which meant they generated alerts but not alarms. By 11:53, the latency spikes became cascading errors, as SyncGuard, no longer able to validate its thermal state memory through the process that had been removed 3 weeks earlier, began cycling in an error loop. By midnight and 6 minutes, the primary synchronization layer of grid flow went offline. 61 enterprise clients lost connectivity simultaneously. Victoria received the call from Garrett at 12:12. She was at her desk in her home office in the Myers Park neighborhood still working, which was her habit. Garrett's voice was controlled in the specific way she had learned to read, which was the way a controlled person's voice sounds when something has gone badly wrong, and they are not yet ready to say how badly. "How long?" she asked. "We don't know yet. Nathan's team is in the building. Get me a status call in 30 minutes. The three of them were in the server facility by 12:20, phones still warm from the calls that had pulled them out of sleep. The server room was lit the way it was always lit, the same flat, even light at every hour. But the screens were showing error states across 6 separate monitoring panels, and the sound of the equipment was different, not wrong in any way she could name, but carrying a quality that experienced technical people recognize immediately. The sound of a system that has stopped cooperating. Nathan made his first diagnosis at 12:30. He identified the failure as a load balancer crash on Node 8 and recommended a clean restart. They restarted Node 8. The system came partially back, held for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and failed again, harder than before, cascading across 2 adjacent nodes. Clara took the next attempt. She identified a state mismatch in the database replication layer, introduced by the restart, and recommended rolling back to a snapshot from 5 hours earlier. The rollback took 27 minutes. The system came back online at 1:14 in the morning. It held for 6 minutes and 32 seconds, and then collapsed again, this time cascading across 4 nodes simultaneously. Todd took the third attempt. He determined that the routing tables across 3 of the affected nodes were corrupted, not from the original failure, but from the cascading restarts, which had written partial state data across the network. He began a manual rebuild of the routing tables. The rebuild took 51 minutes. The system came back at 2:29. It ran for 11 minutes. Then it failed completely. Every primary node in grid flow went dark. The failover systems, designed for brief outages, were not built to handle this class of cascading state corruption. They held for 8 minutes and then went quiet. Victoria was standing in the corner of the server room when the last failover system went dark. She was wearing the same clothes she had put on 13 hours earlier. She had a cup of coffee in her hand that had been hot when Earl at the security desk had handed it to her 90 minutes ago, and was now completely cold. She looked at Nathan sitting in front of the terminal with his hands above the keyboard and not moving. She looked at Clara going through the same sequence of screens for the 4th time. She looked at Todd staring at a rebuild log with an expression she did not have a name for yet, but which she understood to mean that he had reached the boundary of what he knew and could not find the other side of it. She looked at Garrett. Garrett was standing near the door with his arms crossed. He was not looking at the screens. He was looking at a point on the floor, approximately 3 feet in front of his own shoes. His face had a grayness to it that had nothing to do with the lighting. "Fix it," Victoria said. The room did not answer. Nathan was still sitting alone in front of the terminal when the others stepped into the corridor at 2:40. Megan was making calls. Todd was reviewing documentation on his laptop with the look of someone searching for a door in a wall that does not have one. Nathan was doing neither. He was sitting in front of a screen that was full of error states. and he was thinking about an architecture document he had closed after 3 minutes on his first day, and about hand-annotated decision trees that did not follow any convention he had been trained on, and about a training session he had attended 4 years ago in a small conference room on the 9th floor when he was 26 and new to the company, and a man in a plain gray jacket had drawn a diagram on a whiteboard and explained, with a quietness that made you lean in to hear it, why any serious infrastructure architecture had to account for thermal state drift from the ground up. He opened his phone. He scrolled to a contact he had not called in 2 years. The phone rang twice. When the line opened, Nathan said, "You already know why I'm calling." The voice on the other end was unhurried. It was the voice of a man who had been expecting this call and had decided a long time ago exactly what he was going to say when it came. "I left a condition in Note 8 when I transitioned out," Keanu said. "SyncGuard has a thermal state memory that doesn't survive a buffer clear during an active thermal event. The secondary validation check that prevented that from happening was removed about 3 weeks ago. I'm guessing it looked like a duplicate logging process." Nathan was quiet for a moment. In the server room behind him, a monitoring display cycled through a sequence of red indicators, found nothing useful, and cycled again. "Yes," he said finally. "There's a recovery sequence, but it has to be run in a specific order, and the timing between stages depends on current hardware temperature readings. It can't be rushed. Can you walk us through it? I need to speak with your CEO." There is something to notice here in the decision Keanu made at 2:43 in the morning in an apartment on Providence Road, with the kitchen light on and a photograph of a woman in a yellow cardigan on the windowsill. He did not hesitate. He did not weigh whether the people who had removed him deserved his help. He did not sit with the satisfaction of being needed. He thought about 61 companies whose systems were dark. He thought about a freight company that could not locate its vehicles. He thought about a hospital network that could not move patient records. He picked up his keys. Sadie was in her bedroom. He knocked once and told her through the door that he had to go out for a few hours, and she said, "Okay, Dad," in the particular voice she used when she was 3/4 asleep. And he locked the apartment door behind him and flagged a cab on the street. Victoria was in the corridor outside the server room when Nathan came to find her. He said, "There is someone on the phone. You need to talk to him." She took the phone. The voice on the other end asked 2 questions, both of them technical, then said, "Your SLA penalty threshold on your primary contracts is 5 hours and 45 minutes from initial failure. You're at 2 hours and 17 minutes. You have time, but not a lot of it. I can be there in 25 minutes. Victoria said, "Who are you?" The voice said, "I used to be your maintenance lead." She looked at Nathan. Nathan held her gaze and did not look away. That told her everything she needed to know about the rest of the conversation. Keanu arrived at 2:51. He came through the main entrance, and Earl buzzed him through the security door before he had time to speak. There was nothing ceremonial in it. Earl simply pressed the button and held the door, and said his name once. The way you say the name of someone whose presence makes sense to you, even when it surprises the people around you. Victoria was waiting in the corridor. She had set the cold coffee down somewhere, and her arms were at her sides, and she was looking at him with the expression of a person trying to determine what category of situation they are standing inside. "You're the maintenance lead," she said. "I was. Nathan says you designed the system." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. Her face did not perform any particular emotion. "You trained all 3 of them," she said. It was not a question. Keanu looked past her at the server room door. "We can talk after the system is running," he said. "Right now you have about 3 hours and 20 minutes of SLA buffer left." He pushed the door open and walked in. Nathan, Clara, and Todd were all in the room. They turned when he entered. Nobody said anything for a moment. Keanu looked at each of them once, not with anger, not with anything that needed to be named, and then sat down at the central terminal and pulled the keyboard toward him. "Here is what happened," he said. He was not speaking to Victoria or to Garrett, who was standing near the rear wall. He was speaking to Nathan and Clara and Todd, because they were the people who would need to maintain this system after tonight, and there was no version of what he was doing here that was useful if they did not come out of it understanding exactly what had gone wrong. Gridflow has a thermal management subsystem called SyncGuard. I wrote it. It manages the phase behavior of Node 8 under high ambient temperature and high data load. When ambient temperature crosses 91 degrees and simultaneous data load exceeds 93% of peak capacity at the same time, SyncGuard enters a compensatory state that prevents cascade failure. He typed a command sequence, and the terminal displayed a directory structure that was nested 5 levels below the standard architecture directories. The folder name was a string of characters that looked like a build reference number. SyncGuard maintains a state memory, he continued. That memory tells it where in the compensation cycle the system currently is. If the state memory is cleared during an active thermal event, for example during a node restart, SyncGuard loses its position and enters an error loop instead of a recovery loop. That is what caused the initial cascade tonight. The secondary validation check that prevented the state memory from being cleared was removed 3 weeks ago. He paused. From the outside, it looked like a redundant logging process. It wasn't. The room was quiet in a specific way. Clara had her eyes closed. Todd was looking at the floor. "I'm not saying that to assign blame," Keanu said, and his voice carried nothing that contradicted it. "The documentation on SyncGuard was incomplete when I left. That is my responsibility. I should have finished the documentation before my last day." He turned back to the terminal. The rollback made the situation worse because the snapshot did not capture SyncGuard's thermal state. When the system came back, SyncGuard was in a cold start condition in the middle of an active thermal event. The routing table rebuilds after that wrote partial state data across 3 nodes. Right now the system believes it is in 4 different operational modes simultaneously. That is why nothing is reconnecting. He began typing. The commands were not in any documentation available to anyone in the room. They were specific to SyncGuard, specific to the architecture of GridFlow, specific to the thinking of the person who had built it. The recovery requires a manual reinitialization of SyncGuard in a precise sequence, followed by a staged node restart that follows the thermal compensation timing. The sequence has to be adjusted in real time based on current hardware temperature readings. It is not a fixed procedure. You read the hardware and you adjust. He worked. He read the temperature panels and adjusted the timing intervals between stages accordingly. He spoke out loud as he worked, not for himself, but for Nathan, who had positioned himself behind Keanu's shoulder and was watching the command sequence with the focused attention of someone who understands that they are watching something they cannot afford to forget. At 3:37, Node 8 came back online and held. At 3:51, the primary synchronization layer reconnected. At 4:09 in the morning, GridFlow was fully operational. All 61 enterprise clients restored. 4 hours and 10 minutes from the initial failure. 35 minutes inside the SLA threshold. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms are quiet, when a long, difficult thing has finally ended. Clara let out a breath. Todd put his head back against the wall behind him. Nathan was still standing. Keanu ran a final verification sequence, not because he doubted the result, but because he was constitutionally unable to walk away from a live system without confirming its status with his own eyes. The verification came back clean. He saved the session log and pushed the keyboard back. Garrett left the room at some point during the recovery sequence. Keanu had noted it without reaction. Victoria had not moved from her position near the door since she had come into the room to watch. She had watched everything. She had not spoken, had not looked at her phone, had not asked a single question that was not essential. When Nathan and Clara and Todd excused themselves to get coffee, and the server room door closed behind them, Victoria sat in the chair that Clara had been using and looked at Keanu. "I want to understand something," she said. "When HR delivered your termination notice, why didn't you tell them what you knew? About your history with the system, about SyncGuard." Keanu considered the question the way he considered most things, with rushing it, "Because you had already made the decision based on a document that described me as a maintenance lead," he said. "I didn't think there was anything I could tell you in that moment that would change how you were reading the situation. You would have needed context, and context requires time, and a hallway conversation with an HR coordinator is not that time. You could have asked for a meeting." "I could have," he agreed. "When I asked the HR coordinator, who would handle the Node 8 condition after I left, she didn't know what I was referring to. That told me what I needed to know about whether the information would land in time to matter." Victoria was looking at the verification results on the screen. You left documentation behind that partially covered the scenario. It was incomplete. That's on me. A silence settled between them that was not awkward. It had the quality of two people looking at an honest accounting and not flinching from what it showed. The restructuring proposal was brought to me by Garrett Hollis, Victoria said. He did not disclose your role in designing the platform or in training the incoming team. Keanu nodded once. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is a subdirectory in the storage infrastructure layer. I can give you the path. I would recommend reviewing what is in it before you have any further conversations with Garrett about how the proposal came together." He wrote the path on the back of a sticky note he peeled from the notepad on the desk and set it in front of her. Victoria looked at it. She opened her phone. She navigated to the path. She read for approximately 5 minutes without speaking. Her expression did not change, but something in the quality of her stillness changed. It became the stillness of someone who has just recalculated a number and found that the total is very different from what they were told. She set the phone face down on the desk. "How long have you known about that?" "A while. And it wasn't my place to go looking for it. I came across it during a routine audit. I noted it. I didn't go further." He looked at the humming rack beside him. "I also didn't feel that bringing it to Garrett's supervisor was a safe calculation to make alone, without any standing and without clear evidence of anything beyond the existence of a directory." Victoria absorbed this carefully. She was the kind of person who did not respond to information before she had finished sorting it, and watching her process, this told Keanu something about her that the past 2 hours had been showing him incrementally. She had been given a bad map, but the way she was holding the new information suggested she was a good navigator. What happened next took 9 days to fully unfold. It began the morning after the system failure, when Victoria called a board-level executive session and disclosed what she had found in the subdirectory Keanu had identified. The directory contained a 3-year correspondence between Garrett Hollis and a technology consulting group in which Garrett had been steering contract work toward the firm in exchange for arrangements that had no legitimate business justification. The restructuring proposal that had resulted in Keanu's termination had recommended that consulting firm as the source of the incoming specialists, with a fee arrangement attached that never appeared in the documentation submitted to Victoria for approval. Garrett Hollis was placed on administrative suspension that afternoon and terminated the following week. His access credentials were deactivated before he left the building. He left carrying a box through the same lobby where Keanu had passed Earl 11 days earlier, and Earl held the door the same way he always held it, professionally, without comment. The difference was that Garrett did not say thank you. A reporter from the Charlotte Business Journal was in the lobby that afternoon covering a different story. She recognized Garrett from a profile Apex had run the previous year and approached him with a question about the departure. Garrett looked at the camera and said he had followed company policy, had done his job, and that if there were gaps in the information he had provided to leadership, the responsibility for identifying those gaps rested with the people who approved his proposals without asking sufficient questions. The reporter lowered her recorder. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You're saying the gaps were someone else's problem to find?" Garrett's jaw tightened. He turned and walked toward the parking deck. The camera followed him until the doors closed. The story ran the following morning. By noon, 3 other business outlets had picked it up. By the afternoon, the details of Garrett's conduct had reached the technology industry communities where reputations are tracked and shared. 2 firms that had been considering partnering with his previous consulting relationships issued quiet statements distancing themselves from his name. The professional network that Garrett had spent 10 years building went silent, with the particular silence of people who have decided they did not know him as well as they thought. The board issued a public statement acknowledging the internal misconduct, committing to a third-party review of procurement processes, and announcing a leadership restructuring. The statement did not mention Keanu by name, but it referenced a company decision made without full information that had resulted in the unnecessary loss of critical institutional knowledge and committed to corrective action. Kirsten, who had delivered the termination envelope, submitted a voluntary account to the board review panel detailing the interaction she had had with Keanu in the maintenance bay, including the questions he had asked about Note 8, and the fact that she had not known how to answer them, and had not thought to escalate. She did not have to submit that account. She submitted it anyway. It was a small thing. It did not change what had happened. But it was honest, and honesty, in a moment when you could have stayed quiet, is not nothing. Nathan requested a meeting with Keanu 3 days after the system failure. They met at a diner on Central Avenue, a quiet place with good coffee and booths that were far enough apart for a real conversation. Nathan did not apologize with a prepared statement. He said, "I closed your architecture document after 3 minutes because I didn't recognize the organizational convention. I assumed older meant inferior." He held his coffee cup with both hands. "I have been thinking about that for 3 days. I don't think I'll make that mistake again." Keanu did not say it was fine, because it had not been fine, and saying so would have been a kindness that served neither of them. He said, "The convention was unusual because I built SyncGuard around a set of principles that didn't exist yet as an industry standard. It was designed to solve a specific problem that nothing else on the market solved. That's why it didn't look familiar." He set his cup down. "You're a good engineer, Nathan. But good engineers are only as good as what they know to look for." Nathan nodded. He asked if Keanu would be willing to walk the three of them through the SyncGuard documentation once it was complete. Keanu said yes. Victoria's offer came on a Tuesday, which was the same day of the week the original termination notice had been delivered. She had arranged the meeting at a neutral location, a conference room at a co-working space on Tryon Street, not in the Harwell Tower. She said she had done that deliberately, because she wanted the conversation to happen on ground that did not carry the weight of what the previous conversations in that building had cost. She offered him the position of Chief Infrastructure Architect, a direct report to the CEO, full authority over system design, operations, and team structure, resources to build the documentation and institutional knowledge framework that should have existed 4 years ago. The salary was $178,000 per year. Keanu did not answer immediately. He looked at the table for a moment. He thought about Sadie finishing her degree in environmental engineering and the sound she made that was between a sigh and a laugh. He thought about a photograph on a kitchen windowsill. He thought about the 61 companies whose systems had gone dark at midnight and come back by 4 in the morning, because he had gotten in a cab. "I need to think about this," he said. "Give me until Friday." Victoria nodded. "Take the time you need." He called Sadie that evening. He did not ask her what he should do, because that was not the kind of question he put on his daughter. But he told her what had been offered, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, you built the thing they can't run without. I think you already know the answer." He said yes on Thursday, one day early. He went back into the Harwell Tower on a Monday morning with a new badge, a new title, and the same gray jacket he had worn every day for 4 years. He stopped in the server corridor on his way to his office. He stood beside the primary rack assembly for a moment and listened. The fans were running at normal speed. The air circulation was steady. Node 8 was reading at 84 degrees, which was well inside the safe operating range for August, which meant SyncGuard was where it was supposed to be, which meant the system was running clean. He walked to his office. He had a documentation session scheduled with Nathan, Clara, and Todd at 9. He had a meeting with the board at 11. He had a conversation with Victoria at 2 about the 3-year architecture plan she wanted him to lead. And at 5:15, he was going to take the number 4 bus down Providence Road and pick up a rotisserie chicken from the place on the corner that Sadie liked. And they were going to eat dinner together at the kitchen table, and the photograph on the windowsill was going to catch the last of the evening light, the way it always did. And he was not going to say anything about what the week had cost, or what the week had returned, because Sadie already knew, and some things are large enough that the best language for them is no language at all. There is a thought worth sitting with before we leave this story. The world will look at a title before it looks at a person. It will read a salary figure before it reads a face. It will assume that the person carrying the plainest credentials carries the least knowledge, when in fact the opposite is very often true. The people who do the deepest work are sometimes the people who ask for the quietest rooms, not because they have nothing to offer, but because they are offering it already, every day, in the form of a system that runs clean, a problem caught before it becomes a crisis, a foundation that holds so steadily that no one thinks to wonder who built it. Knowledge does not disappear because an institution stops seeing it. Competence does not expire because a title is removed. And the value of a person is never, not once, located in the line on an org chart that describes what they do. It is located in what they know, in what they built, in what they choose to do with it when someone finally needs them at 2:40 in the morning and has no one else to call. Keanu did not fix that system to prove something. He fixed it because 61 organizations were in the dark, and he knew where the light switch was, and no one else did. That is not heroism. That is the quiet, unannounced form of integrity that most of us never witness, but all of us, at some point in our lives, desperately need. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated, only to discover who they really were? Share your story below. And if you want more stories like this, stories about ordinary people with extraordinary hidden depths, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.